This is going to be a double act between Andrew and myself, and I'll do the first half, and Andrew will do the second half. Incidentally, if you hear heavy breathing online, it's not me. My dog has decided to sleep behind me in my study and is snoring very loudly, so don't be put off by that. It's a case study of two sort of townships. Interesting choice of phraseology, townships rather than towns, of the 1960s in Newcastle and Dundee. And it represents, if you like, an attempt to provide self-contained new towns that weren't officially part of the New Town programme in the UK, but were nevertheless very similar on a smaller scale, and represent what Simon Gunn refers to as a bright new world of convenience, efficiency, and plenty. And what's unique about them is that they are not just peripheral to the cities of Dundee and Newcastle. They are more than peripheral. They are basically out in the sticks, out in the countryside, and very similar to, if you like, how the New Town programme was built. But interestingly, for very countryside-based places, the schemes were exceptionally brutalist in style. So a style of architecture and design you would normally associate with perhaps urban areas. And these were absolutely monster superstructures in many cases that were planned to house population decamped from the cities. And of course, the city working class population in this sense were perhaps associated with the port and with shipbuilding that already started to decline quite seriously by even the early 60s. We looked at a place called Killingworth, just north of Newcastle upon Tyne, and Whitfield, outside Dundee. I started this research when I was still at Newcastle a couple of years ago, and Andrew has a direct connection with Whitfield, having grown up there as well. It's a story of rise and failure, of course, because what we saw after a mere 15 years or less is the complete demolition of the structures, the razing to the ground, literally, of them, and also associated with perhaps what they were trying to do idealistically and perhaps conceptually and certainly architecturally as well. And they were replaced by a sort of typically suburban cul-de-sac style of residential development, mainly owner-occupied rather than social housing. And that in turn led to a domino effect of the gradual coalescence of the urbanized parts of these cities between the core city areas and these remote isolated towns that suddenly were part of the greater city area over the following 20 years. I'll zip through this quickly. We have a lot of images to tantalize the senses, and Andrew will finish on some conceptual points at the end. Killingworth is up there on the North Sea coast, not really on the coast, but inland. And if you look at the map, which is actually from the 1940s on the right, you can see the city of Newcastle upon Tyne, the urbanized area to the south. And where's Killingworth? Well, it didn't exist on this map in any meaningful sense, but it's right in the middle. So that's how isolated it is. And it looks quite rural. It looks quite countryside based. It was planned as a uniquely public-private partnership in the 1950s and 1960s. And it was there really to serve the city. And the notorious leader of the city council at this time, T. Dan Smith, had the ambition to obviously improve working class housing and do slum clearance programs in the city. But it was Northumberland County Council, the neighbouring local authority, that took on the powers and acquired the land and agreed to put in the infrastructure. And gradually they sold off the land to private developers to either build council housing, local authority housing programs, or even in the 1970s, quite uniquely, private housing as well. The land, though, was not exactly rural. It might seem rural. If you go back into the Industrial Revolution, then this area was littered with coal mines. And the difference is that decline had happened at the start of the 19th century. So by the 1950s, it had been derelict urban land for maybe 100 years, that returned to the rural. It had returned to nature, except, of course, it was severely contaminated and needed cleaning up. And this is what the program started to do. So it was distressed rural land, open moorland, and waste dumps. And if you look closely, you could see evidence of that former industrial mix. It was meant to be self-contained communities, so it was about decamping urban populations out into these towns, but also there was an attempt to put new industry there. So the British Gas Research Council headquarters was put there, similar approach to, if you like, the New Town program, and it was meant to be a social mix. It was designed by a guy called Roy Gazzard, he's an interesting and somewhat bizarre character, and he talked about providing a township based on his colonial experience of working in Uganda. It was in the spirit of the Garden City movement, so major urban settlements against a green backcloth are certainly true, but he preferred the word township to new town because, as he says, its associations with immaturity. And it was creating a Christian social town. So he was very much into the ideal and ideology about creating not just social engineering, but something perhaps a little beyond that. Uniquely, it was built on a hill, and he likened it to a modern castle town. So the idea that you could have a moat, you could have walled settlements, and you could have baileys, towers, of a castle that represented, if you like, through the housing blocks. A former colliery pit shaft was turned into a lake, and so that's how, if you like, the landscape was improved there. And this was the first, if you like, design for the scheme, which looks like a British new town with one or two high-rise settlements and emphasis on maybe Christian worship with some of the taller buildings there, and the moat, the lake, is immediately in the foreground there with a bridge across to it. But this is in the middle of, if you like, rural Northumberland at the time. The first phase represent some interesting designs of modernist construction, skarn method, so back to the first speaker's presentation. And you can see the site gradually being prepared in the 1960s in phase one, with a mixture of terraces and smaller units of fairly low rise. And you can see some of the employment centres being located at the same time. Phase two, though, was quite different. And these were, if you like, the castle elements of them. Amazing superstructure, walkways in the sky. And these were known as garths, Garths, and none of them had names. They were all numbered. Which provided, if you like, a major problem for how residents found their way around once they had moved there. It got so much of a problem that the council installed drain covers with maps of the estate on it so that people could navigate their way around wayfinding by reference to the drain covers all the way through the estate. And there was a city centre, a town centre built there. But as you can see, although there were sites for car parking, most people did not have cars. They couldn't afford cars. So it was working class communities, very much social housing. And we have not been able to undertake direct research. How do you interview residents of this area when the place was demolished 35 years ago? But we did find Facebook groups. And so we've taken some quotes from the Facebook groups about residents who were there at the time. And you can see here, so it might look imposing. It's a great place to grow up back in the 70s. And Francis saying, never really thought about it, but Hebbard probably had one of the best views front and back. No wonder my mum caught me missing buses to stay off school, as she could see all the bus stops from where she was. And because it was on the hill, of course, it suffered the full force of northern gales coming into it. So it'd be lucky to not be blown off your feet as you walked across these walkways, which were considerably high in between the buildings. When I went to the school, every now and I walked over this walkway, and every now and again we got shouted at by skinheads and shot at by air rifles. So you begin to see, if you like, the flavour of the place, that it began to have major social problems, as well as being a town of hopefully 17,000 people decamped from industrial urbanized Tyneside. This was elements of the pub, the Puffin Billy. I remember the Puffin Billy pub when you could get electrical goods delivered from Woolco, that's the shop next door. You could place your order with a lad there, and the item would be delivered to your table at half the price. Great service. Of course, it didn't last. And as the problems escalated through high unemployment, deprivation, drug problems, so the authorities, local authorities, decided that there was no point in even some form of intervention to regenerate the existing urban fabric. So by 1987, it started to be demolished. It only lasted something like 16, 17 years. And what replaced it was, if you like, a reference to private owner-occupied residential suburban type development. So these are before and after pictures, and I'll zip through them very quickly because of time, but they're from exactly the same viewpoints. And you can see the transformation in the urban environment by this change as well. Oops, sorry. And underpasses. So, you know, it was principle of what we might call good sustainable living at this time, but some of that green backcloth kept. And what was left there compared to those aerial photographs from earlier is what you might typically associated with more suburban type development on the edge or quite close to an urban centre with ring roads, plenty of greenery, large gardens, and a mix of housing styles as well. And the town centre itself, the superstructure, was demolished and replaced by, if you like, a small district 1980s, 1990s shopping centre as well. As you get on to phase 4, this is now into the mid-1990s and onwards, what we're seeing is the areas around Killingworth suddenly becoming infilled by major out-of-town retail parks, out-of-town office developments, and warehousing and logistics services, almost like what you might refer to as the Amazonification of the space between the city and the separate new town. And associated with that, of course, the roads being improved between them as well. Killingworth was only, I think, something like 5 miles, 7.5 kilometres between Newcastle and Killingworth, but the roads being improved just in turn facilitated a whole swathe of new developments. So Killingworth Village in this map is at the top centre of the screen. Previously in that 1940s map, it was totally isolated from the rest of the urbanised area. Newcastle boundary is to the bottom of that suburban housing at the bottom. That marks the boundary of the city. And you can see that between Killingworth and Newtown, you have a series of major peripheral development now happening, which has caused coalescence. Not only the industrial estates you see here, Benton and Coram Park, but actually the red areas are what is currently ongoing or might even be built in the next few years. So much further housing, much further plans for industrial parks and mixed uses, and they clustered around the two north to south roads, one to the left, the A189, and the A19 to the right. So the coalescence of Newcastle with Killingworth is there to be seen. And these plans are continuing with the council, if you like, providing it. It's an interesting fact, though, that many of these developments are still associated with providing if you like, residential space for the city itself, even though it's a separate local authority, because there's just no space in the city to accommodate any further growth. It's a very tight boundary. So if you like, the neighbouring local authorities, as they did in the 1950s and 60s, are providing the growth space for the city. I'll now hand over to Andrew, who will share the screen himself. Oops.
You need to unshare your screen, Mark, so I can share mine. Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, I'll try and be quick. And someone's just started doing drilling outside, so that's bad timing. So this is Whitfield in Dundee, quite spectacular. This is on the edge of the city. It's about a mile long, and it has it's all deck access flats. Where is Dundee? Where is Whitfield? So Dundee on the same coast as Newcastle, facing Oslo. Dundee is on the edge of the Scottish Central Belt, the kind of large urban area in the middle, and then Whitfield on the bottom slide there you can see is in the extreme northeast of the city, about 3 to 4 miles away from the city centre. So in Dundee itself, Whitfield is notorious. No urban development in Dundee has encountered the same level of infamy as the so-called Scarn flats, such a failure in design and social terms that it's almost without peer in Scotland. So it's one of the kind of classic failed sink estates in the sort of Dundonian imagination. Context of Dundee is really important, and this speaks to the idea of central peripheries, peripheral centralities. Sorry, so it's the fourth largest city in Scotland, and Dundee is really an industrial city par excellence, both in terms of its economic structure, both in terms of its spatial layout, and also the relations between people within the city. It's got a very specific local politics. It's characterized by a sharp class conflict historically. In the middle and late 20th century, it had a strong communist influence, both prominent leaders of the council and even a small burgeoning communist party. It's also been a city of local corruption between developers and the city council, and it's also distant from the other major metropolitan areas within Scotland. And lastly, the city has had an intense experience of decline with significant population loss, derelict land, and a very brittle economy that is very narrow and lacks diversity. And it's really struggled to kind of transform itself into a successful post-industrial city. Whitfield has 4 phases that I'll talk about. And the first one was its conception in 1952 as part of the city's post-war plan, quite similar to Per's Oslo case study there. They were going to build self-contained neighbourhoods across the ring road, which would be, have schools, shops, hospitals. And Whitfield was the last one being built very quickly using Swedish Scarn methods between 1969 and 72. It was built on the edge of the municipal boundary, right in the top corner there, about 3 miles from the centre. So there you can see 3 other of the neighbourhoods, and Whitfield was built right at the edge, and it was built last. So there were 4,000 units with a planned population of 12,000, and its design concept was typically modernist: deck access, interconnected walkways, maisonettes, neighbourhood units, and so on. The area was also quite topographically challenging, but this didn't deter them from wanting to create a rational hexagonal plan with level walkways, and in doing so, they kind of created lots of awkward spaces that kind of led to not being fully integrated into the public realm. There's just an example of the high modernist vision from the 1960s there, and here we could see the actual the plan as it was realized, and you can really see how extreme this hexagonal morphology is, right on the edge of the countryside. So you'd hear animals and wind and rain right against these kind of brutalist structures. So it was quite strange. There's a lot of nostalgia, usually by older people in their 50s and 60s who lived here when they were children. But really, it was a terrible place to live on the whole. In phase 2, the decline and decay started, and the chairman of the Whitfield Partnership, which was a regeneration organisation in the late 80s, was set up. Basically describes here an account of the qualitative aspects of the estate: abandoned buildings, fire damage, debris, broken glass, abandoned blocks of flats, and so on and so on. And this point here about the residents rejected the dwellings, even when they were giving choices of new dwellings in the area. They didn't want them. A lot of people wanted to actually leave Whitfield. So indicators that were created in 1990 showed that only half of the population was realised at this point. There was 1,000 vacant units, 54% unemployment. Now, this was when Dundee had about 12% unemployment, and this was roughly at the time of the early 90s recession. Widespread poverty there, and also a kind of majority feeling about wanting to actually leave the estate entirely. The Whitfield Partnership was set up in 1988, spearheaded by the New Life for Urban Scotland white paper, which was about bringing together agencies and public bodies to agree a plan for the renewal of the area. And 4 areas of Scotland were chosen based on the 1981 census data of multiple deprivation, of which Whitfield was one. And the task was to arrest and then reverse the process of decline, specifically tackling housing and the environment. And I'm not going to focus on these for too long, but a spatial plan was created, and the sort of typical cross-cutting policy features are here. You know, more private space, increasing the range and quality of community services, restore hope, and opportunities for new forms and types and tenures of housing is the kind of key aim that has really transformed the area. So within a short space, in 5 short years, then there was a dramatic shift in the tenure of housing. So the scarn blocks were demolished. Housing association houses increased dramatically, and in percentage terms, then this represented a massive growth in owner occupation from 5% to 15%, and from 18% vacant units to only 6% vacant units, and a massive growth of housing association housing as well, from almost 0% to 13%. So there's a massive shift there in tenure. Now, these two images here represent almost like two contrasting visions of housing and community and society. On the one hand, you've got this high modernist vision built around the neighbourhood. On the other hand, you've got this privatised space, the cul-de-sac. And I'm arguing here that both Killingworth and Whitfield have experienced a sort of process of incorporation and dissolution based on a radical shift away from social and public and communitarian aspects of urban living towards privatised and individual ones. And you can see here how over time, Whitfield has gone from being a sort of centre in itself to becoming gradually encroached by surrounding suburbia, and that is being driven by the fact that Whitfield itself has also been largely demolished and swept clean and replaced with these kind of low-rise suburban households, which have also extended adjacent to the scheme, which gives the impression that the scheme never existed in the first place. They have retained some aspects of the old scarn blocks here in the middle and here to the left, but on the whole, if you were walking around this area now, you would never know that Whitfield ever existed. And this is the municipal boundary here with neighbouring Angus Council, and Dundee and Angus have historically had a joint structure plan where they would work together on spatial planning issues where it concerned the boundary. And over the boundary, you can see the development of private housing here, again, giving the impression that Whitfield never existed. In terms of in terms of multiple deprivation, this is the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. The blue is good, the red is bad. And we can see here on the eastern side of the scheme where the private housing is built, there is a kind of a middle classification of the estate. There is lingering poverty in the northeast. So even the focus of the estate, even the balance of the estate and the centrality of the estate itself has been dispersed. A bit like Killingworth, this is now typical in Whitfield. And this is the buildings that have remained, that have been they've been repurposed, and they look a bit more pleasant than the old ones. And this is where my mum used to live in the early 90s. This was a scarn block, which is now just nothing. The key changes were the demolition of the scarn blocks, replacement with cul-de-sacs and mixed tenure housing, the rehabilitation of the town centre, environmental improvements, private housing adjacent to the original scheme, reorientation of the estate's core, the growth of suburban retail nearby. And so on that point, we will just try and bring these two together. So the two towns then share a similar design approach to decant people from the urban core to the edge of the town. They were meant to be self-contained with limited car ownership and employment provided near the schemes. Growing social problems afflicted both of them. Both of them typified rural brutalism, and neither of these schemes worked. And also, there was quite a late vision, you know, late 1960s was actually quite late in terms of architectural history, in terms of building these deck access flats on the edge of the city. The 1980s decisions to demolish them were basically wipe the slate clean, pretend it happened, get rid of any concept of socialist utopia, and bring in the kind of suburban privatized housing. And yeah, so this reflected the kind of movement of suburbanization, which then created a domino effect to allow coalescence between the towns and the cities through the building of out-of-town retailing and warehousing and business parks. So it was almost like a gradual incorporation into a sort of more middle-class suburban landscape. So there's been three kind of points we want to pick up on here then. There's been a reimagining of what urban community is, a very sudden shift from a cohesive community to an individualistic private residential suburb. There's been a massive modal shift to redesign middle-class aspiration lifestyles in terms of transport. So there's been a massive increase of car ownership with road improvements, a switch from public to private transport, and that enables residents to have a much larger access to a wider labour market across the city. And in Dundee's case, and in Newcastle's case, I think it was also about how these two schemes you know, represent what the city needed after the Second World War. The divisions of the cities themselves were about, you know, creating an industrial economy and then housing the working classes. Both cities then went into decline, and the estates no longer served the economic purpose for the wider city. So now in Dundee, the narrative is about housing choice and bringing in the middle classes to work in the service economy and to work in the quaternary economy as the city tries to reimagine itself. And then lastly, the role of the towns was undermined and replaced by a political need towards owner occupation. So yeah, I've just actually said that point there. So I've tried to kind of hurry that along. So hopefully that's not too over time. So that's us.
No, look, I had a time in my head and you've hit it on the nail, Andrew. So thank you very much. So you're right on
great.
the time that I have that I had picked in my head, so that's great. Look, thanks, Mark, Andrew, fantastic. Looking at your images there and some of the issues that you've covered, I was kind of, you know, hints of nostalgia on two fronts. One coming from Belfast and having grown up and lived in the Divis Flats for a short while when I was very, very young. And then also my PhD work when I was in London, and one of my estates looked very much like went through one of those massive urban regeneration processes. And I think some of the issues that you covered speak to those concepts of kind of blandscapes, blendscapes, and particularly brutal scapes. So you mentioned, Andrew, you're talking there about the brutal architecture, but I suppose the brutalness of kind of the social environment it's created through that physical environment as well, and some of the brutalness of day-to-day life on those spaces, and then the conversion to what I'm kind of been using this term kind of brutopian scape. So there's a blend of, you know, it's aspirational, it's utopianistic, but there's a brutalness depending on who you are and kind of where you are in the process. It is either brutal, its impacts on you, or else it has a utopianistic outcome for different people. So on that note, I see we're going to open it to the floor, and I see Peer Gunner is definitely the first one out of the traps this time. So Peer Gunner, over to you.
Thank you. Well, not surprisingly, I found this very interesting as it kind of intersects with stuff that I've talked about. So I just want to comment on the fate of such estates in different social and political contexts in Europe. So I don't know all the details around Europe, but I know that in Britain there are a number of estates that have been demolished. I don't know how many. Maybe you could answer that. And at least in also, to my knowledge, no estates have been demolished at all. There may be, you know, some because of some densification process going on or something that they demolished one building or something, but not like that. So I kind of wonder if we could if there was done as some, it's always difficult to do a comparison and really a comparison that where you could try to get some theoretical insights on that in the intersection between kind of architectural theory, the physical aspects of these estates, and the social structure and aspects. So what are the kind of what are the differences and similarities, and could we see, is there something to learn theoretically in that intersection between architecture and social science from comparing such projects and the fate of such projects? That's my question. I found it very interesting.
Well, I'm happy to do a quick response on that. I think what's happened in the UK with regards to the two towns is now being represented on a much bigger program, ideological program, you could call it, from the Conservative government. And there are now large parts of cities, especially in London, where public housing estates are being earmarked for complete demolition. If you're a cynic, you say this is nothing more than a land grab of social housing estates by private developers, enabled and facilitated by politicians who believe in market responses. I also think there's an element of a degree that Brits are uncomfortable with modernism and what that style of architecture represents in the minds of some people, people who don't live in these places, I should add. And there's another heritage battle going on in the UK at the moment about whether post-war architecture, modernist and certainly brutalist constructions should be preserved or not from a heritage point of view. And we've seen, even in the last 2 weeks, cabinet ministers intervening directly to stop the preservation of some of these 50s, 60s, 70s architecture and allow them to be demolished. And that, cynically, again, you could say this is nothing more than the program to remove all aspects of a socialist era, you could say. But actually, it's something deeper than that, because a lot of the residents who are being decamped from these estates, of course, are being scattered right across the UK. This is not about rehousing them on site. It's not about rehousing them in the vicinity. It's about allowing them to, or finding places for them to live maybe 100, 200 miles away. So this is a decimation of community associated with it. And that's a difference compared to these two towns as well, where there was an effort to rehouse people back into the community on site. Andrew, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll just say three very quick things because I see that Nick wants to come in. But you can't separate social architecture from the idea about the welfare state. And I think the sort of reworking of the British welfare state in the 80s, but again in the last 10 years, has been really deep and traumatic for a lot of people. We've got food banks on the rise. We've got this normalization of urban precarity again. And I think that these estates kind of represent a type of urban class that a lot of middle classes don't enjoy seeing and knowing. So that, especially in London, get rid of the estates. That's kind of the narrative. The second thing is, I think in the UK, we lack this we've got a very binary approach to density in the UK. People think of density as either an individual house or a tower block. And people seem to be very unfamiliar with the kind of European density of 6-story, 4-story perimeter courtyard buildings, or mixed tenure in these kind of mixed blocks. Now in Scotland, it's different because we have tenement buildings, which are slightly more European, but still here, there's this lack of imagination of what about the in-between? Why did you have to go from one extreme, which was the hexagonal block, all the way to the kind of fake Thatcherite aspirational middle class? And the third thing I'd say is, if you look at cities like Liverpool, which have got a radical history of social uprisings, you'll find that in the 80s, when Liverpool was taken over by Michael Heseltine because of corruption in the local council, they've built suburban housing right in the middle of Liverpool, where working class people used to live, as if to say, we're going to civilize you, we're going to build an urban morphology that kind of is antithetical to political protest. So that's all I'll say about that.
Thanks, Andrew. And Nick, you've got a virtual hand up, so.
As always, living in a virtual world now, so yeah. Hey, I really enjoyed that, and I also wanted to make a couple of links maybe to Per Gunnar's talk a bit earlier. I mean, one thing I came back to, just sort of comments really here, was the way in which the urban periphery provides this sort of literal and figurative space for idealism, utopianism, creativity, maverickness, whatever you want to call it. And I think that is a really interesting thing, and it links to the next thing I just wanted to sort of comment on. That was, I wonder whether you could say a little bit more or reflect a little bit more on the legacy of, I guess, what is a peripheral centrality or centralities in the two cases that have been lost. You know, they were their own centres, stuck out in the sticks a bit. Something's been lost, but and of course, you know, they were interpreted as failures, and including in the Oslo cases to a certain extent in terms of, you know, the social life of these places. But of course, in some ways, they were proof of something. They were proof that development could come to these places, and so a state-led, fairly perhaps utopian set of communal living ideas may have failed in some sense, but actually has provided some sort of proof, not proof of concept, but at least in physical terms, you know, paved the way for business as usual, whether it's suburban development or regeneration opportunities that the private sector now flows into. And I you know, there's a sort of legacy there, you know, while these places have sort of disappeared and much of what they, or some of what they stood for might have disappeared. There's also a legacy going forward in the sense that out of this, something lost or failed has come great opportunity for, you know, the business as usual real estate development.